Welcome back to another episode of Chronicles of Cricket. So let me take you back to 1996 for today's story. India are on a tour to the West Indies, and for anyone who played or watched cricket in that era, you know what that meant. Fast pitches, hostile crowds, and a history that wasn't exactly kind to the visiting Indian teams. And just before the tour, India suffered a huge blow. Javagal Srinath's shoulder injury flares up again, and he's ruled out. This is massive because Srinath wasn't just India's fastest bowler, he was the strike bowler. Brian Lara, the great West Indian batter, once called him the most dangerous bowler that he had ever faced. So, for a team already walking into a very tough tour, losing Srinath was changing everything. But the injury itself, it wasn't very sudden. Srinath had picked it up during the Shahara Cup in Toronto earlier that year, and it worsened during the long tour to South Africa where he bowled many tireless hours. By the time the West Indies tour came around, the medical team had no option but to rule him out. At this moment, you expect the most obvious step, don't you? Replace your injured fast bowler with another fast bowler. But that is not what happens. Instead, the BCCI secretary at the time, Jayant Lele, receives an emergency fax from the captain, Sachin Tendulkar. And Sachin doesn't ask for a pacer, he asks for an off spinner. I love this particular detail because it tells you so much about Sachin, how he thought about the game even then. He's not reacting emotionally at this point. Sachin's thinking was that an off spinner might be more effective in the Caribbean, especially against the number of left handers in the West Indies team at the time. What makes this interesting is the lack of an off spinner had already been questioned when the original squad was announced. Just 2 weeks earlier at the press conference, the chairman of selector Ramakant Desai had been repeatedly asked that very question. Why no off spinner in the squad? He was clearly irritated at that point. He snapped back saying, "Show me an off spinner who can take wickets of left-hander and I'll include him in the side." So that was the scenario of off spinners in the country at that point. Now, suddenly 2 weeks later, the selectors are being tasked to do exactly that, to magically produce the mystery off spinner. But Sachin on his part did narrow down the search. He suggested two names, Baroda's Tushar Arothe and Hyderabad's Kanwaljit Singh. Both were known quantities in the domestic cricket. But when the selector announced the replacement, it was neither of them. And this is where the story takes a sharp turn. Because the name that comes out is Noel David. And I can tell you at the moment, most people, media, fans, even players had the same reaction. Who is this Noel David? Lower order batter, off spinner from Hyderabad. He'd had a decent India A SARC tournament, yes, but even within the Hyderabad cricket, his Ranji place wasn't exactly locked in at the time. So the idea that he'd suddenly leap into the Indian team felt almost baffling. So you can understand that the confusion was genuine. Noel had indeed scored a double century earlier in his first class career, but it came in a match where Hyderabad had already piled on 900 runs and almost everyone had scored big runs. So it wasn't one of the most noticeable performances anyway. And then comes the line that follow him for many years to come. A press rumor began circulating that Sachin himself had reacted to the selection with disbelief. He apparently had said, "Who is this Noel?" Now, years later, Noel would say that Sachin denied ever making that comment. Noel believed that Sachin would probably have remembered him, having played against him in junior cricket. But by then, it didn't really matter. The line stuck, the narrative was already set by the media. Statistically, the selection remained a bit difficult to justify. Tushar Arothe, one of Sachin's original suggestions, had averaged over 35 with the bat in first class cricket. Kanwaljit Singh was also a domestic performer. So whether Noel was picked for his batting depth, his bowling, or simply because selectors felt he fit a specific role, it was never entirely clear, to be honest. Here's the thing, none of this was Noel's fault after all. He didn't pick himself, he didn't fax the board, he didn't create all this confusion. He just had an India cap in front of him. And when he finally got a chance in the second ODI, he actually delivered. India bowled beautifully that day. Abhi Kuruville and Venkatesh Prasad ripped through the West Indian top order, and Noel, he sort of cleaned up the tail. Ian Bishop, Curtly Ambrose, and Franklin Rose. 3 wickets for 21 runs, and India end up winning the match by 10 wickets. For your first international wickets, you take that every single time. However, the early promise didn't quite translate into a long run. Across the remaining matches, Noel picked up just 1 wicket, and his batting contributions were sort of rather limited, with scores of 8 and 1. From a purely numbers perspective, his returns were eventually very modest. But in cricket, numbers don't always tell you the full story, because if there was one area where Noel David stood out unmistakably, it was his fielding. And remember, this is the 1990s. This is not an era of athletic fielding units, especially for Indian sides. Noel had trained earlier in his life as a 100 and 200-meter sprinter, and he had this natural athleticism about him. And under his domestic coach, Sampat Kumar, he had really become elite in fielding. So when Sunil Gavaskar saw him play, he once famously said that Noel David might have been the best fielder India had ever produced. Coming from Gavaskar, the legend, this was a significant praise. Now, think about that for a moment. A man with a handful of international games, and Sunil Gavaskar says that about him. That's something you probably carry with you throughout your life. But his international career ended very quietly. One last ODI opportunity against Sri Lanka in Asia Cup. And surprisingly, his domestic career didn't last much long either. He played just 35 first class matches in total, and by 2005, he was completely done with cricket. Years later, reflecting on his career, Noel said that he performed to the extent where he thought he delivered the goods, but regardless of what happened, he cherished every moment playing for the Indian team. It was a measured assessment, neither defensive nor very bitter. And maybe that's the most human part of this story. He wasn't a failure, he wasn't a star, he just passed through Indian cricket briefly and then almost very quietly faded. There's one final irony though. The two players Sachin originally recommended, Tushar Arodhe and Kanwaljit Singh, they never ended up playing international cricket at all. In 2019, Noel David was appointed the chief selector for Hyderabad and also the chairman of the junior selection committee, effectively overseeing the same selection system that once selected him under such unusual circumstances. Life has such a strange sense of symmetry, from being the answer nobody expected to the man asking the questions. And maybe that's where this story really ends, with a reminder that cricket history isn't only about legends and numbers. Sometimes it's about these brief moments, strange selections, and careers that flicker and disappear. And somewhere in all of that is Noel David. That was another forgotten story at Chronicles of Cricket. See you next time.